Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the world's most protected country is slowly being abandoned, and not by its enemies, but by its own closest allies. Welcome to today's Explainer. You see, for decades, Israel literally looked untouchable. The United States defended it, Europe armed it, Western media protected it, and honestly, any country that challenged Israel usually found itself completely isolated on the world stage. But something has shifted, quietly at first, and now, well, much more suddenly. Countries that spent years standing right beside Israel are starting to pull away. We're seeing trade threats, weapon suspensions, massive UN reversals, and open discussions about sanctions. Even politicians inside America are now openly talking about cutting military aid. So today, we are going deep into why Israel's global support system is cracking, why younger generations are rapidly turning against it, and what actually happens if this 70-year alliance completely collapses. Okay, let's dive right into this. To really understand where we are today, we kind of have to look back at the unbreakable international shield Israel used to enjoy. Let's rewind to 2011. The UN held a vote about Palestine joining UNESCO. Now, Israel opposed this hard, mostly because they didn't want to legitimize Palestine as a state. And at the time, 65 mostly Western nations stood shoulder to shoulder to act as a massive diplomatic shield, backing Israel all the way. It was this huge showing of unified support. But fast forward to 2024, and the contrast is absolutely staggering. Countries that historically defended Israel without a second thought are now using those same UN votes to signal that their automatic defense, yeah, it's over. So let's start with part one, the unbreakable shield. The nations that formed that protective barrier aren't just, shifting seats at the UN. They are actively pulling away. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of the shift. Check this out. Italy suspends parts of its defense cooperation. France straight-up restricts military-related Israeli flights, a move so huge that Israel preemptively halted arms purchases in response. Then you have Spain, Ireland, Slovenia, and Belgium actively starting to discuss EU sanctions. Even nations that generally avoid this kind of controversy, like Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, are totally shifting their tone. Listen, when your longtime allies start changing sides like this, that is a massive, blinking red geopolitical warning sign. Which brings us to part two. The tipping point. So what exactly caused this rock-solid coalition to crack? Well, the war in Gaza was an undeniable catalyst. You had all these raw images of destruction, bypassing traditional media narratives and going straight to social feeds. But the real breaking point? That was the regional escalation. When the conflict with Iran threatens critical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, oil fears absolutely explode. Global markets panic, and energy prices surge. Suddenly, you have European economies, which, let's be honest, were already struggling, facing the possibility of another massive financial crisis. Supporting Israel abruptly went from being a comfortable historical stance to being politically and financially expensive. And if there's one thing politicians absolutely hate, it's an expensive ally. And this pivot isn't just happening in Europe. Take a look at this number, 40. Recently, 40 United States senators voted for a resolution to literally block U.S. arms sales to Israel. Now, sure, the resolution didn't actually pass, but the message was earth-shattering. Almost half of the American political system, inside the very institution that has been Israel's ultimate safety net for decades, voted for an arms embargo. It's a glaring signal that the American shield is actively fracturing. Let's move to part three and see how this builds, the generational divide. Because as massive as these recent conflicts have been, they really just accelerated a trend that's been building for a decade. Just look at the historical scaffolding here. Older generations view Israel through the lens of profound historical events. The Holocaust, the Arab-Israeli wars, the post-9/11 global war on terror. But younger generations, they didn't live through those events. They grew up entirely in the smartphone era. They're seeing real-time, unfiltered, raw footage of checkpoints, bombings, settlements, and civilian casualties right in the palm of their hands. And that has completely, fundamentally changed their perception. To put that old mindset into perspective, look at this quote from former German Chancellor Angela Merkel back in 2008. "We will support you forever because of the Holocaust." I mean, that perfectly encapsulates the traditional Western approach, an alliance that is intrinsically, permanently tied to the past. But as those historical events drift further into memory, the youth of today simply do not possess that same inherent emotional anchor to that history. Now, what's really interesting about this NBC poll data is how it maps out our future reality. Today, young Americans view Israel negatively by a massive 5-to-1 margin. Millennials view it negatively 2-1. It's really only the oldest Americans who remain solidly positive. This is a rapid, staggering shift in public opinion. And here's the harsh reality of geopolitics. Once public opinion flips this dramatically, politicians are eventually forced to follow the voters. That 40-senator vote we just talked about, this demographic shift right here is exactly why it happened.
So how do you respond to that part 4, Israel's backup plan?
Here is the truly fascinating twist in this whole explainer. This generational shift was not a surprise to Israeli leadership. Nope, they saw it coming years ago, and they quietly executed a highly calculated plan to achieve true strategic autonomy. Step 1 was making peace with regional neighbors to lower immediate existential threats. Step 2 was aggressively building up massive domestic weapons manufacturing, ensuring they could actually survive if Western imports just suddenly stopped. And Step 3? Well, Step 3 was perhaps the most controversial, cultivating an entirely new international network. Analysts like Dahlia Scheindlin dubbed this strategy the other friends policy. Israel realized that Western democracies were becoming increasingly critical, right? So they intentionally cultivated new alliances with right-wing illiberal democracies. We are talking about aggressively courting leaders in countries like India, Brazil, and Hungary. Leaders who admired Israel not out of some sense of historical guilt or shared democratic ideals, but because they admired its unapologetic militarism and hardline nationalism. And honestly, for a while, it worked perfectly. Hungary, for instance, acted as Israel's absolute best friend inside the EU, repeatedly vetoing the exact trade restrictions and sanctions that other European nations kept trying to impose.
But that brings us to part 5, slowly, then all at once.
Because a backup plan is really only as good as its foundation. And right at the very moment when Israel's Western shield is crumbling, its carefully constructed backup shield is completely falling apart too. So the crucial point here is how incredibly fragile this other friends policy turned out to be. It relied entirely on specific hardline personalities staying in power. In Brazil, the fiercely pro-Israel leader lost his re-election bid and ended up facing jail time. In Hungary, Israel's absolute most crucial EU ally was ousted, and get this, the new government actually threatened to arrest Prime Minister Netanyahu on war crimes charges if he ever visited. Literally almost overnight, the diplomatic resurgence Israel banked on completely vanished. It really brings to mind this famous Ernest Hemingway quote, "Change happens slowly and then all at once." If you step back and look at the big picture, the deep, unquestioning pro-Israel consensus across the Western world is gone. The shifts we're seeing right now in the UN, in European parliaments, and in the US Senate, these represent the slowly phase. But given that staggering generational divide, plus the sudden failure of Israel's backup alliances, well, that all-at-once phase, it's approaching far faster than anyone anticipated.
Which leaves us with this final massive question to chew on. What actually happens to the balance of global power when the alliance that shaped the Middle East for 70 years finally collapses? It really isn't a matter of if anymore, it's when. The geopolitical map is literally being redrawn right in front of our eyes. Because if this trend continues, the balance of global power may never look the same again. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.